Council at Yes Every Kid Foundation. Hopefully you're here for the Unlocking Government Programs panel, because that's what we're going to have. And today we're going to talk about, what states are doing in order to make education more accessible for children and families. So states have looked for ways to enable families to access education irrespective of zip codes or incomes. And in many states, this has led to different types of government programs that enable funding to follow students, whether they decide to attend a different public school outside their zone, or an alternative such as a private school, engaging in homeschooling, or some other personalized education program. So these programs include school vouchers, tax credit scholarships, individual tax credits and deductions, and education savings accounts. Today we're going to focus on education savings accounts, primarily because they generally involve the highest degree of government administration, thus becoming the most complex and difficult to navigate. So there are currently 15 or 16 states with ESA programs, depending on whether you count Georgia. Just trying to figure out whether the bill was signed yet by the governor. Tuesday. Yay, okay, thank you. I knew somebody would know. And Louisiana, hopefully, will be the next state to adopt a program. So today, we're lucky enough to be joined by John Ward, who's the Executive Director of the Arizona Empowerment Scholarship Account Program, which is the oldest program. It was adopted in 2011. And he's joined by Whitney Marsh, the Director of Policy Operations at Yes Every Kid Foundation, who leads up our implementation capability, and she'll explain what that is in a little bit. But let's start with John. John, if you could just describe the program in Arizona and what your role is with that program.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you, because this space that you all are working out of, which is so innovative and so new and just really charting kind of a new path, is really exciting, and I'm really happy to be part of this. So I started off as a public school teacher many years ago in Tucson, so a very kind of traditional route. And so I worked in that space for many years as a high school social studies teacher. Then I spent the next 16 years auditing all the public schools in Arizona. Not so much financial audits, but really auditing their efficiency and their effectiveness, kind of what worked, what didn't work. Not so much in getting academic results, but just in terms of operational efficiency. And now I'm the executive director of the Empowerment Scholarship Program in Arizona, and I've been in that role a little less than a year, but incredibly exciting. So as Lynn said, the program started in Arizona in 2011, and I think similar to some of the burgeoning and new programs popping up around the country, it focused on a narrow group of students. It started off for students who had a disability who were currently attending public school. And so as time went on and as the program evolved, more and more eligibility classifications were added. So at some point we added students who lived on a Native American reservation, students who had parents who were active military or had been killed in the line of duty. And then ultimately it culminated in 2022 with universal expansion. So every single school-age student in the state, as long as they reside in the state and they're school age, they are eligible to be part of the Arizona program. Students who participate in the program receive 90% of what they would have gotten had they attended their local public school. Currently we have about 77,000 students in the ESA program, and Arizona has about 1.1 million students, school-age students in the state. Of the 77,000 students who are on the program, about 17% are kind of those original students, students who have a disability. And then we have the other 75% who are there through the universal expansion program. And then about 9% is miscellaneous students, again, who live on a Native American reservation, active military, and so on. And so again, as Lynn alluded to, because of universal expansion about a year and a half ago, this program has scaled up really quickly. We went from a program of about 13,000 students to today, or this week, a program that has over 77,000 students. And so the big challenge has been just scaling up in a short amount of time to a program of that magnitude.
And Whitney, would you describe what we mean by implementation?
Yeah, so Whitney Marsh, Director of Policy Operations at Yes Every Kid Foundation. Happy to be here. I'm based in Arizona. We're a national organization. We have people all over the country. But John and I have crossed paths before in our careers. I've been in state government in Arizona for the last 15 years, most recently at the Arizona Department of Education, so very familiar with the growing pains of implementing a new program. So implementation, our Yes Every Kid Foundation implementation is one of our capabilities. So it's very priming us for this conversation using that term. We work very closely with our partner organization, Yes Every Kid. That's a C4, which is an advocacy lobbying organization that's working in states all across the country to pass laws that implement a family-first education freedom approach that really allows for students to access the opportunities that best meet their needs, whatever those are. And so what we found was that we could go into states and convince lawmakers that, look, your public wants this. Your families want educational freedom. They need access to their public funds in order to pursue other opportunities outside of this traditional system. And they would pass a law, and then it would be extremely complex and complicated for not just families, but for the education entrepreneurs, the schools, the education service providers in the states to use the program. So Yes Every Kid Foundation set up implementation as one of the capabilities that it would leverage to support states in operationalizing these programs. So we have the law, the letters on paper, that then agencies like the Department of Education or Department of Revenue have to implement and turn into a real program that people can access. So it really is how you operationalize it. What are the foundational policies and procedures? How are people going to apply for the program? What technology do you have to use to allow families to access the program, to submit an application? What documents do they have to upload? What are the timelines and deadlines for submitting applications, for reviewing and processing them? So implementation is just all of the ways that we put in place the program and make it real. And what we found is that because it's such a new way of doing business, not for government does this all day long, right? We give money to specific populations of people for certain purposes, for healthcare and for food and nutrition. But in education, we don't. We have a public system, and the state deals directly with public schools and never has to engage directly with individual families. And so it's just, we've learned a lot over the last 10 years in places like Arizona and Florida that are doing this, but we're still at the ground level and haven't really figured out what do we want this program to be when it comes to operations and implementation. Do we want it to look more like SNAP, where you get a card that has restricted uses and you can go and buy services and goods that are related to the education of your child? Do we want it to look more like an earned income tax credit, where you meet the qualifications and you get the money in your bank and you can spend it however you like? We haven't really had those policy conversations, and it leads to people like John and his staff having on very limited resources, again, too. Like, it's a government-funded program, and the folks that are passing these laws often don't want to spend a lot on administration. So trying to figure out how to create a program that is easy to sign up for, easy to use, and actually meeting the felt needs and desires of families is complicated, but that's essentially, in a nutshell, what implementation is how we're defining it, at least right now.
Okay, so thank you for that. I actually am part of another capability at Yes Every Kid Foundation, which is the Edupreneur Support Program, which you heard about from Mike Donnelly earlier. But one of the questions that we get, particularly now in Wyoming and hopefully in Georgia, starting Tuesday, is, all right, great, we've got this new program. How do we get prepared for it? What do edupreneurs need to think about when you talk about those policies and the procedures and everything that come along with a program? You know, who decides what they are? Can they influence those? And, how should people prepare for it? I know that's a long question, but anything that you could, illustrate to enlighten us would be great.
Yeah. You want me to get started?
You can talk about from a national perspective. I can just talk about Arizona.
Yeah, I think one of the parts about my role that drew me to this role was I had worked on policy, really as an analyst, looking at bills that were moving through the legislature in Arizona and sometimes in other states, and try to figure out what the impact was and how it actually would turn into something that people could use. And I think that there is an assumption that that through the legislative process, we've thought about all these things, and that we're very intentional about putting certain words into law, like accreditation, and we know what it means. And we actually don't. And when you start digging down and asking people, like, oh, okay, accreditation for K-12, what does that mean? Why do we care? Well, because we want our kids to go to college. Is that required to go to college? No one is further asking the question. So it's just, what happens is the laws are typically very specific in certain ways and then very vague in other ways, and leaves a lot of room for the administrator to try to figure out and create more clarity and definition. And so they do that through a few ways. One is typically administrative rulemaking. So this, you would often call regulations. It usually goes through a process that's defined in law, so you have to publish your rules in a certain way where the public can view the rules and then make public comment on them and have so much time to do that, and then they'll get adopted in a public forum, like at a state board of education. But those rules, sometimes, it depends on what state you're in, sometimes they literally just mimic the law. They just use the same exact words as the law and they put it into rules. They might add a little bit more, but not much. Other times, rules are used to put things into the law that aren't in the law, create, broaden definitions that were included in the law, because it's hard to go back and change a law, to get votes, especially with these laws. Getting the votes to pass an ESA is really tough. Even when you have a majority in the legislature, negotiating on all the little finer details and the budget impact, all of it is really hard. So once the law is passed, any errors that were made in the drafting process or oversights, really hard to go back to the legislature and get it changed in the law. Sometimes rulemaking is used to do that, to provide some clarity or an interpretation or more guardrails around some vagueness that's in the law. Then the other part of implementation and where these definitions and rules are fleshed out would be in policies and procedures. So internal policies and procedures that the program manager is developing. So looking at the law might require you to only use your funds on qualified expenses. Qualified expenses could include things like tuition and fees at a qualifying school. What is a qualifying school? They'll have to define that. You can use it on curricula and supplemental materials required or recommended by the curricula. Do you hate that I can quote this stuff word for word? It's very, very annoying.
You're hired.
What are supplemental materials required by what is curriculum? There's no definition of curriculum. What counts for that? Can I write it down with a pen on this piece of paper and submit it and then get whatever I said was required approved? I mean, this is the stuff that they have to figure out. And it's just, anytime we go back to the legislature to say, what did you want us to do here? Like, we don't know. We don't know. You're the experts. You figure it out. We don't want to talk about this. And so every opportunity that's presented, and when I was at the department too, we would always try to check ourselves and saying like, these people don't have time to come and go to like our meetings and give us feedback. So it's only when you're really causing people pain that they show up and like give you, right, that are giving you comments, joining your task force, joining your town hall. But your input in all these processes is so important because we really just don't know. Fingerprinting, another really good example of this. It makes sense to almost anyone that you would talk to that we would want our kids to be in safe environments, that the adults that we are leaving them with have a background check, and you say fingerprinting, you're like, yeah, of course, yeah, include fingerprinting. But that has a very specific definition in law. A fingerprint clearance card, only certain people are eligible to get those. They're on the, we were looking at one state in particular that we're building that requirement into rules. If you're going to be a qualified provider under the law, they wanted to require that all of your staff members had been background checked and had a fingerprint clearance card. Well, you go to the state website for fingerprint clearance card, and there are like specific categories of employee types, right? And then it says on the bottom, if you are not in one of these categories, you are prohibited by federal law from applying. And so it's just things like that it takes iteration after iteration and input. It's not with, I think, bad intention that these things are added, but don't assume that there isn't an opportunity to speak into it and say, actually, did you know, I know what the goal is here, it's safety, right? But if you use those words, it means this in this other section of the law, and it's gonna prevent our families, our teachers from accessing this program, and I don't think that's your intent.
Yeah, thank you, that was a great answer, and I'll speak specifically about Arizona's experience. In many ways, administering the Arizona program, because of its size and scale, is very challenging. But in one way that it's somewhat easy is that in Arizona, we have no statutory authority as an ESA program or a Department of Education to regulate vendors and schools within this Empowerment Scholarship Account program. And so because of the lack of statutory authority to do that, we're not trying to navigate the very things that Whitney was talking about here. So we have a pretty hands-off approach to who is, quote, approved vendors. We don't really have approved vendors because we're not putting our seal of approval on any vendors. So in Arizona, you simply say that you are going to provide services that will accept ESA dollars, and for the most part, that's it. And so you become so we work with Class Wallet as our financial solutions vendor. And so you let us know, we pass it on to Class Wallet. Class Wallet then reaches out to the vendor saying, give us your bank account so that we can move funds from Class Wallet.
No big deal, just give us your bank account information.
From Class Wallet to your account. Really the only expectation that we have or requirements that we have for vendors are for those who are providing tutoring, because state law does say that anyone providing tutoring in the ESA program has to have some type of credential. And again, that's not defined on what that credential is.
I think the law actually says accredited, which is, again, where we're like, what does that even mean to be an accredited tutor? That's not a thing.
Yeah, exactly. There's no national accreditation for tutors. So the way we have operationalized that here in Arizona is simply to say, if you have a high school diploma, then that is an accreditation that we will accept. And I think the basis for that is that there are a lot of really smart, talented, capable college students who haven't graduated yet, who could provide tutoring to high school kids, junior high kids, and so we felt like high school diploma was a good place to start. And thus far, it's been working out just fine. But really, that's about the only requirement that we have on vendors. Again, it's always the prerogative of the legislature and the governor to sign law, but at this point, from an operational perspective, I'm not sure that we would be that interested in adding any more requirements, because as you all know, in this kind of school choice environment, and if it's really about empowering parents, as soon as you start to add one more layer of restriction, you're going to get pushback from parents who say, now you've restricted my option set here, and we don't want that. And so I think we have to be very careful if we're ever going to pick those fights from a operational perspective. Again, if the legislature and the governor makes that decision for us, that's one thing, and we will always kind of follow the legal expectations. But from an operational perspective, I think it's just not philosophically aligned with the movement and where it's going. And so when Whitney brought up the issue about background checks and fingerprint, again, I think, there are so many folks who would say, well, that's an easy place to start. But again, I think there are a lot of parents who would come back and say, but we can do our due diligence. We don't need the government adding another layer of kind of regulation or restriction on that. That's our job to do. But I work for an elected official, and so it creates kind of this tension, because as soon as you have a bad actor, a pedophile who provides tutoring and abuses a child, then they point their finger at the Department of Education, the state, who should have been on top of this, who should have stopped it. Because philosophically, that's where we've been for most of this country's history with our traditional public schools. And so as soon as we come back and say, but really that was the expectation of the parent to do their due diligence, it's just the public doesn't accept that easily. And so it puts us in a tough spot from a PR perspective. And at the end of the day, and I think someone brought this up in the opening session, while that's going to happen, we know that in ESA and school choice context. Unfortunately, it also happens in our traditional public schools. And so you're never going to root out all the bad people. And so again, because these things happen, I think we have to just be prepared and accept that happens, and just put things in context and say, okay, again, parents are the best kind of custodians of their children, and we trust that they're doing their best to minimize those types of things that happen.
Thank you. John, you mentioned Class Wallet, and I live in Florida, and Florida's ESA program uses an administrator called Step Up for Students. But can we just talk about how different programs are administered, and what are the choices and what are the roles that different people play? And maybe, John, you could start by describing how Arizona decided to do it, and then Whitney, maybe you could talk about how some of the other states have gone.
So we contract with a third-party vendor to provide a few services for us. So on the enrollment side, we do that all in-house in Arizona. So it's my staff on the front lines who are determining or reviewing and approving proof of residency and other birth certificates, things like that. And then we work with Class Wallet to essentially provide a few things for us. One of the things that they provide is a marketplace of mostly curated items. And so if you are an ESA family, and we fund accounts on a quarterly basis, so you just had your account funded, what are some options where you can go through a platform and buy things that you know more or less are approved, and there's not going to be any question about whether they're acceptable or allowable or unallowable. So Class Wallet has that marketplace. We also have direct pay to schools and to online schools and other vendors. With one of those things where families simply submit invoices to my staff then reviews them and pays the vendor directly. And then we also allow for, and Whitney alluded to this earlier, debit cards, and we allow families who have the resources to make purchases and then seek reimbursement. And so it's interesting. I think initially the expectation was that the Class Wallet marketplace for Arizona would be kind of the primary place where families could get all of those allowable goods. But again, in a environment where we are seeking innovation and where we are unleashing choice, it's impossible to know kind of that whole set of things that reasonable people could buy to educate their students. I think oftentimes one of the starting points is, well, do we find that in a public school? And if we don't, then it becomes questionable. But again, we're applying kind of this backward-looking model to a model that we're trying to strive for looking forward. And so I think that's a struggle for both policymakers and those on the front lines who are implementing programs, because typically you're not going to see public schools buying chicken coops or duct tape. But those are things that we can all imagine could have very valid educational purposes. And so when we see duct tape come through, we absolutely are going to approve it. because they're, obviously there are kids building something wild and they're having to use kind of their mathematical skills and their left side of the brain and whatnot to build these things. And so as time has gone on, I think the conversation has moved from how do we, continue to expand a marketplace, which we know we're never going to be able to do. And I think the conversation will start moving towards these debit cards where you simply say you have this much in your account and you're able to use it. In Arizona, we do have some legal parameters. I mean, primarily it has to, these dollars have to be spent on tuition, textbooks, tutors, curriculum, and educational therapies. Those are kind of the 5 really big categories. But with it, like Whitney alluded to, within curricula, I mean, that could be used to justify almost anything.
Anything.
So again, when you are a parent and you want to submit something for approval, again, this doesn't have to be curricula that was created by, some big company out of New York who's creating curricula. This could be parent-created curriculum. So they've gone online, they have pieced things together of what they want to do, or they found some other parent who did something really cool and kind of just documented what they did, why they did it, how they were going to assess it. And they send that to us. And again, my staff, their job isn't to assess whether that's valid curricula or not. It's simply to say, okay, did they at least have some basis for asking for this item? And as long as it seems reasonable, and again, judgment has to be part of it, we approve it. But again, this creates, this is what makes administering the program really difficult, because there are things that, are requested using ESA dollars that I think politically speaking, if the media were to jump on it, it makes people feel uncomfortable, especially if they're thinking about the traditional kind of public school model that we've had. And so we're always trying to balance, if we approve this and if this gets out, how are we going to handle this? And is it worth that type of fallout? And if we approve it, then we've set a precedent that this is always going to be approvable. And so are we committed to this? And it's this type of tension that we struggle with quite a bit. And there are times when it's really low-hanging fruit and it's easy. So we're never opposed to families buying watches to teach their, especially analog watches, teach your kids how to tell time. But when you submit the $15,000 Rolex, which is a real story, yeah, we're never going to approve the $15,000 Rolex, even though you have enough money in your account to do that, because you had a student with a disability and you're getting $45,000 a year from the state of Arizona. We're not doing that. Or recently, someone had submitted a $24,000 golf simulator to work on their motor skills, and it was, recommended by a therapist. Well, from our perspective, there's probably we can get to the same spot without a $24,000 golf simulator. Now, do we want to be in the position of saying we want to use not a golf simulator but do this instead? No, but we do have to balance kind of that prudence and public perception with operating this program in a way that will sustain it long term and minimize kind of serious attacks to the program, because as soon as there's a lack of prudence or it's just kind of totally wide open and there are just kind of a series of perceived abuses, politically it makes it really difficult for the space that we work in. So it's just trying to balance those interests.
Yeah, that sums up exactly the dynamic and the tension in implementing these programs and why many of the programs are being implemented a little bit different, is because that tension is uncomfortable. The tension between the government's responsibility for oversight of taxpayer dollars and that prudence he's talking about, and then the individual's right to receive the benefit they're entitled to under the law and have ease of access to it. That's another, and so the more complicated you make the program to try to control how people are spending the money, the harder it is for people to access the things that they really need. So we're always trying to figure out that balance, and we have not figured it out whatsoever. And so, like John said, Arizona is the most permissive in how you can spend your money and the least regulated for private schools, micro schools, providers, that has made other states uncomfortable. And so when they go and like pass their laws, like, great, we love choice. We love students having access to private school options. Very uncomfortable with this idea that families are going to be creating their own education model and asking to buy earthworms, and because are those a live animal? Are those allowed? The number of toys, a lot of programs in other states that have passed have explicitly prohibited purchase of toys. So that it's very easy to get into this situation where John and I were talking yesterday. I'm like, I did not want to talk about Legos anymore when I was in the department. Like, are Legos a toy or are they an educational tool? They're definitely an educational tool. You use them in like every single classroom. But if you are prohibiting toys, they're in the toy section at the store. So what a lot of states have done is pass ESA laws that have more restrictions in how you can spend. So they all allow you to spend on tuition and fees. Some of them allow you to spend on curriculum and supplemental materials, but then they'll have a much more restricted definition of supplemental materials that are allowed. And all states are implementing this with a platform. So I'm trying to think. Arizona is the only state that has as large of a state staff administering the program, and Arizona runs the application process internally in the Department of Education, and then contracts through the Treasurer's Office with ClassWallet for that financial platform that they talked about, the marketplace. And now every other state is using that marketplace and isn't using debit cards. Debit cards are really hard to restrict. You can put merchant category code restrictions on it, so it can prevent you from using them at certain places, but it isn't down to the SKU level. So you can't, unlike your HSA card or a SNAP card, EBT card, when you go to the store and you swipe it, it automatically only pays for things that are approved under the program and doesn't. We don't have that in education whatsoever. We don't have an accepted definition of what an educational good or service is the way we do for business expenses or medical expenses, with some tax laws. And so it's just something that we're figuring out as we go. And one way to create guardrails for how families are using the money is through these platforms. And so I'm trying to think of all the states that are actively implementing. Essentially, some states are doing it like Arizona, where the state might have a few staff, and then they contract with a third party to do the applications and have a marketplace platform. Some states are putting the entire program out to bid, and so a third party program manager, like a scholarship program, runs the entire program. So Utah ACE Scholarships is running the program, and then ACE Scholarships, which is a nonprofit, they do the applications, and they've contracted with ClassWallet for a marketplace. New Hampshire is similar. Children's Scholarship Fund, which is a nonprofit scholarship program, they do private scholarships across the country, similar to ACE. They're running the New Hampshire Education Freedom Account program, and then they contract with ClassWallet. Step Up for students in Florida. Florida's a little bit different because scholarship granting organizations, there can be multiple in the state that administer not only the ESA, but also the tax credit scholarships. Usually those are separated. The administration of those are separated in other states. But in Florida, Step Up for Students administers all of the scholarship programs, including the ESA. And they're a nonprofit, and so they're building internally a marketplace. And so I'm trying to think of what other setups there are. Sometimes lawmakers, we don't want to put this in the Department of Education because we don't trust them to administer it the way we think it needs to be administered. And so they put it in the Department of Revenue or the Treasurer's Office. So West Virginia, it's the Treasurer's Office that runs the program. And they've contracted with a third party. They contracted with Step Up for Students actually to do the whole thing, do applications, outreach, and the marketplace. So they're all working a little bit different, but also all kind of the same. Like every ESA program essentially requires both the family and the education service provider, including schools, tutors, micro schools, to register with the state on this platform. And the family requests to pay the provider, and then the program manager approves that payment, and then either through direct pay or something of that sort, ACH, the provider gets paid.
Okay, well, I have lots more questions, but I want to make sure we have time for your questions. So happy to take questions from any of you. You had your hand up first, so.
I'm from Louisiana, so we're watching this bill coming through. And my question is what you were talking about earlier, where the lawmakers may be the intent behind it is one thing, but you're excluding the negative intent. The way the bill is written right now would exclude my school, but I think the reason they wrote it that way is to exclude like family homeschools. So I could fix the wording with an extra 5 words, that would maybe still keep their same thing, but how do I have my voice heard in that? Is it too late in the process at this point?
I'm not sure if it's too late in the process because I don't lobby, so I'm not in the weeds on what's currently happening. But oftentimes it's the national organizations like EdChoice, AFC, American Federation for Children, Yes Every Kid, are in states, have a presence. There's usually also a state-based group, and so is it Pelican? Pelican in Louisiana, and Georgia can, exactly, and associations too. So like if there are private school associations, I mean, sometimes if you're a micro school, they're not gonna represent your interests always in that debate, but finding those.
There are other large private schools, 600 to 1,000 students registered just like mine that would also take 2 years or 6 now. But I'm not going to want to change.
Yeah, I'm trying to think the best. So I know every state's a little bit different in like the local dynamics of the coalition. We would call it the groups that are working together to come up with the bill that they're pushing forward and compromises and go through negotiations. But there's typically, would it be, I'm looking at George because you've been involved in some of these things, is Pelican like working with school providers and
so often
to
in
get
the bill passage process, unless you're directly connected and know someone, it is tough to have the voice heard. I mean, the members are part of the coalition, but you have to kind of, I know it sounds horrible, you have to kind of know someone that's in the political and public policy arena to have your voice be heard. Usually it's after the fact, and then we run these cleanup bills that cause political problems.
Or can it be clarified in the policy process?
Well, it depends. Sometimes it can, a lot of times it can't. So even, I'm trying to think, even like reaching out to the legal capability to say, hey, this bill is moving through and there's provisions in the law that are going to have implications for education entrepreneurs in Louisiana that are going to exclude us from this law, we would give that information to our lobbyists that are working in the state. I mean, we're always coming up with a list of like, these are the issues and the story. And so that is like reaching out, I mean, OutSchool. I've talked about OutSchool so many times because that was one of the use cases that families brought to us first when we were switching to Class Wallet, and they were like, we can't spend our money at OutSchool if you are forcing us to only spend it through this marketplace. And so whenever we, like the people who are politically connected or connected to the policymakers, have specific examples, it really helps because lawmakers, if you just say like this is going to be a problem because X, Y, and Z, this hypothetical, it doesn't matter. Like they have a goal in mind, right? And they think that they're solving a certain problem. But if you can point to Veritas Press can't serve students in this program because you're preventing them in this way, or OutSchool can't, or this school can't that's in your district, So these are really great questions, and they always stump me because I feel like we need a better answer to, we're saying like, oh, you should be involved. And then you're like, how do we get involved? And we're like, I don't know. Yeah.
But I will second what Whitney said. We sometimes get that feedback from edupreneurs through the Edupreneur Support Program, and then I try to feed that directly to Yes Every Kid, our lobbying sister organization. So that is an avenue. I can't guarantee that they'll have any success, but at least we're passing on the concern, and they know it, so that if there is an opportunity to do something about it, depending on what the political climate is, they can try to do something about it.
So I guess my question, is more of a statement now, since you started to ask the question, but it was more about the implementation. I know, I'm from Alabama, and Alabama, in terms of homeschooling, has been one of the least regulated states. But now with the ESA, there is a language in the new ESA bill that requires homeschoolers to be tested, to have these nationally normed assessments in order to receive not even a third of the money that is allocated for a child who is attending a traditional public school. As a micro school owner, there's an even further burden that as a micro school owner, I have to, in order for me to receive ESA funds, I have to provide these national norm assessments, which are expensive.
Yeah.
So my concern is, how do I even position myself to receive the ESA when it seems as if there's all these parameters put in place for an entrepreneur like myself to be able to even be a vendor? Because in addition to the testing requirement, there's also an accreditation requirement as well. So I don't have the data that an accreditation body would even want me to have. I've only been operational for 2 years. So how can a state say that it's a free marketplace now for education when it is in fact limited how much of a free access it actually is for educational workers?
I feel you, and I think the testing is another great example, not just of barrier or using the old way of doing things from the old system and placing those regulations and measurements on this, what we're trying to do here, which is try something new. But to your point, I don't think when we're making those trade-offs, when I say we, I just mean policymakers in general, are making those trade-offs and saying, yes, we want accountability and we want to know that kids are reading and can do math, they understand what logistically and financially that means for small operators. Utah, this happened in Utah too. There's a testing requirement and they're trying to figure out how do we fit the students have to take the state test. Where do they do that? How are public schools going to accommodate potentially tens of thousands of kids during testing week that are not their students? And so having that information, I know Ed Choice is really good about coming up with their talking points and research that points to some of these issues. I know that we're trying to do that too, collect these proof points. And even like what you're saying, another implication of lawmakers being uncomfortable with a new model, new way of doing things, is that in states like Alabama or like Oklahoma that are passing these laws, they're allowing for it to be used on home education, but they're giving you less money, sometimes a lot less money, like $1,500. And so I think, again, just like we're trying to iterate on this, and the more information that we can get now so that not only next session in Alabama do we have those talking points with lawmakers, but as other states pass, we can say that testing requirement sounds great, but it ends up costing micro schools $700 per kid when they're only getting $1,000 per kid. Like, they can't do it, so they're opting out. And oh, by the way, those numbers you're trying to see like hit in participation because you want to show that this is a popular program, you can't get to those numbers if you're going to be excluding all these providers.
So the only thing I'll add, in addition to what Whitney was saying, I think with some of the information that they provide to policymakers around the country, you guys are really well positioned to change the dialogue, because in the school choice space, academic outcomes is not the only outcome metric that I think this space cares about. Now, that's the primary focus in public schools, but in this space, and it was alluded to earlier in the opening session, it's about well-adjusted children, the seeking of the good and the beautiful and the just. And those are things that public schools traditionally have not focused on because there's no agreement on what the good, the beautiful, and the just is, and what truth is. But we can do that in your space, in each of these micro school spaces. And so I think part of it is just changing that dialogue, that this one outcome doesn't have to be this kind of this end-all, be-all. That there are other things that we're shooting for here, and so therefore to have this testing requirement is kind of missing the boat here, because there are so many other outcomes that we should be looking at, that if we looked at, I think would give a fuller picture of what we're doing. But again, I think it's policymakers are still stuck in the mindset of the old model. And so it really is just kind of being iconoclastic and shattering that thinking as we move forward.
Yes, sir.
So as you said that, this is not my question, but I'm wondering, is a challenge to the College Board coming, right, to kind of shape things up? Because I think that's one of the voices that's in the ear of lawmakers. It helps them fortify that traditional thinking. Just be wondering out loud. I wanted to go back to what you were talking about in the beginning, related to rule. What's that adoption process look like for rulemaking? And then is rulemaking, the rules that get made, is that as in force as the law itself? Does it carry the same weight? And then what does the adoption process look like? So I'm wondering if there's an opportunity to participate there.
I'll say a little bit about what I know and then let John chime in. So I think most states will have what's called, or an equivalent of, an Administrative Procedures Act, APA. Sometimes they're voter protected, but it will, is that where you would start out to Google APA in that state? And it will describe the process, like it has to be posted in a public place, like on a website for so many days before it goes for a vote or gets adopted. Sometimes they're not voted on, they just get adopted by the agency. But these are actually really hard to track. We've been trying to be more on top of what states are doing with rulemaking, and sometimes there's a place on the Department of Education's website, there usually always is, that will have rules, and then it will have pending rules, so it'll show you like a draft, and then there will be a timeline of like when public comment is due, if there are any public meetings or town halls or things like that to give feedback on. But it is really hard to track, like the State Board of Education. Their meetings will typically be, I think in every state it's like this, they'll have scheduled meetings for the whole year, so you can go to their website and it'll show you when their meetings are, and then usually a week or 2 weeks before the meeting an agenda will be posted, and it would include if they are considering rules. It's not always, so I think administrative rules do have the force of law.
Well, once they're passed, yeah.
Once they're passed.
Or once they're adopted, I should say, yeah.
And then, and you can answer a little bit of that too. I think the other things that we're looking for in these programs that are, it is policy that goes even further than the rules in the law, are handbooks. So almost every program will have a family handbook and maybe also a provider handbook that goes through kind of like the frequently asked questions and how to navigate the program. But that is used to set out some of the administrative policies that the program uses. So kind of how John was describing, what they accept to be an approved tutor is in the handbook. And so that wouldn't be subject to the APA because it's not technically rules, but it will have things that you'll want to pay attention to and speak into.
And also, just before we leave that point, that's an element for challenge too. So I've worked with edupreneurs who have brought something to my attention that wasn't supported by the law or the regulations that were adopted, but was in the policy handbook. And therefore we said, you have no basis for imposing that requirement on learning environments. And so we actually got a little traction and got Step Up for Students, in this case, to change the policy. So there are things to keep an eye out for, and particularly when it comes to things in the handbook that aren't supported by the regulations or law, you do have a voice there for challenge.
And in that case, was the rule an amendment to, or did you guys just change the policy altogether? And then you had to, yeah.
In this particular case, it didn't require any legislative action or rulemaking action because that policy that was encapsulated in the handbook didn't have a basis. So they made it up, not malintentionally, but because they felt like it basically implemented the intention of the program, but there was a mismatch.
And generally speaking, I know that rule typically cannot ever conflict with law, and if it does, and sometimes it could, it still gets in there, then again, for me being the administrator, I will always then just rely on what the legislature passed and the governor signed. And so I'll give more precedence, or I'm sorry, more weight and emphasis to the statute versus the rule. But I mean, 99.9% of the time, they're consistent. And then to go to the handbook, even after that second iteration, so you have statute, then you have rulemaking, which kind of further operationalizes and clarifies things. Sometimes there's still ambiguity left. And so we as an agency, we try to provide some level of clarity and, if you're working for an elected official, some level of policy preference that you try to introduce that within the allowable parameters of statute and rule, because anytime we're changing anything, the first question we're asking is, does this conflict with either statute or rule, and do we have a little bit of wiggle room here to do this type of thing? But to Lynn's point, oftentimes when you introduce anything like that in the handbook, for anyone who opposes it, the very first question is going to be, where in statute or rule do you have the ability to do that? And so again, that's why, just as administrators, we're always trying to figure out, based on our stakeholders and what we've heard and kind of what we think would work best, and being, again, kind of good stewards of this public program, what can we do in the interest of the program within the parameters of the law? And again, that's always much more difficult in practice than in concept.
Sorry, in the green first.
My question is, in some ways more general. Everything that's happening here sounds awesome, and I'm from Georgia, so yay, this will work for me in Georgia, but I'm about to go and speak at a very large conference in Pennsylvania, telling them that actually you can do hybrid schooling here, and basically they're all like, you don't know Pennsylvania, you're really sure they can't do that, and I haven't heard anybody mention the word Pennsylvania in terms of funding for anything. So I'm just wondering, okay, so we've got these 16, maybe soon to be 17 states that have got this money. Does anybody up here have any concept of when some of these more, try to refrain using any adjective, I'll just say northeastern type states might be likely to become more friendly to innovation and education in a way that makes it so that it doesn't seem like a complete impossibility to be innovative up there?
Actually, Pennsylvania had an ESA bill that was moving last year, and then and they have a Democrat governor that was put it in their budget. He put it in his budget this year. I don't think that it's looking promising for it to pass this year. It's really complicated getting the votes and all the trade-offs that would have to be made. They do have a tax credit scholarship program in Pennsylvania, but I think it is something that caught our attention, that there is a Democrat governor that was actually proposing an ESA program. And I think it's part of this is pointing to states like Arizona that have had ESAs for 10 years, and our public school system did not go away. We did not destroy it, and that's not the point of these either. It's to give flexibility and options to families. And what we find too in Arizona is that families move in and out like as they need it based on their students. And it's not the same for all kids. If you have more than one kid, yes, do you want them all to be in the same place? That would be preferred. It's easier, more convenient if they're all going to the same place at the same time all week. But that often doesn't work. And so being able to articulate this in a way that's not just public school bad, private school good. You know, like we're not trying to privatize education. That's not the purpose of these policies. It's the work that you're doing. It's to find new ways to engage students in the joy of learning, to find their purpose and their skills and apply it to their community. And this is allowing us to test and experiment, and it's not all or nothing. It complements the existing system. We're still trying to figure out how to make the funding work. And I know Pennsylvania is unique in their school finance system, very unique in how their school funding works. And so, and they do have, someone there was telling us how the public schools provide transportation already for private school students in their districts. So they're already using public resources to support kids that are using other options. And I think it's only a matter of time when it's no longer a partisan issue, and we're really just like families are demanding more options. I think we're also at an interesting part in our country where population is starting to decline. Birth rates went down during the recession and never came back up, which means that public school enrollment is just going down in general, and it's not the fault of choice programs, it's just population demographics. That is important because it also creates, in many cases, a budget surplus. Like we're no longer funding all of those kids, so we have some extra money where we can fund these other programs without impacting the public schools. So I just think that, again, like these things evolve. What seemed impossible 4 years ago, right? Like 4 or 5 years ago, universal choice programs did not exist. And now we're seeing states say, we're not only funding switchers, we're going to fund anyone who's school age in our state to choose the option that they want. So, hang tight.
Although I will make one statement there. I mean, you can do anything with or without the funding, but the other problem is being able to do it within the regulations that exist in the state, and that's a problem in Pennsylvania. Sir.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, in
sorry.
Arizona, we never lose sight of the fact that failure is not an option, that we have to succeed, and we have to succeed very well, because if we fail in Arizona, and this is really true of almost any state that has the program now, it just kind of sets the entire movement back. So it makes it more tough for Pennsylvania. But if we can succeed with flying colors, it makes it much easier in Pennsylvania for them to look at all of these states that have done it and that have succeeded very well and say, that's what we can have if we did this here. And so we're always very mindful that while we first and foremost serve Arizona students, that we're part of a national movement, and so we kind of rise and fall together. And so we want to ensure that we're always doing our very best to succeed with flying colors.
And so just picking up on that, I mean, Arizona is leading the way. I'm in the state of Missouri, and I was really encouraged by the way you described the beginning of the process, because that's kind of where we are in Missouri. It's like, okay, special needs students, and like, okay, is there a way to like expedite this process? So, I mean, if you were talking to our policymakers, would you say, hey guys, just rip a Band-Aid off, or would you say, no, go slow, like, ripple it?
Yeah, in some ways, Lynn and I were talking about this earlier. While I think in a perfect world we could we could go from 0 to 60 overnight, in some ways I think there's a lot of benefit in scaling up kind of slowly and over time. It may not need to be a decade, because Arizona's already done that and kind of paved the way. But I think because scaling up is really difficult, and this is uncharted territory in many ways, I think kind of piecemealing it over a few years is probably helpful from just an implementation perspective. And so that's kind of my thought on it.
My view on it is that the more targeted the population, the more, like, the harder it is for that target population to access the program, because they have to provide all these documents to prove that they meet the eligibility requirements. It's so limited that new supply isn't going to come on board, because they're like, well, there are only like 1,000 kids eligible for this program. Why am I going to start a new school? Why am I going to open and expand and offer more seats? Because now families have access to resources that maybe didn't before. So it's, you know, for the purposes that John mentions, I think taking little bites off is, like, works for some states, but we can look at some other states too where they've never moved past that. Like Mississippi has a very tiny program, hundreds of kids in their ESA. And it kind of is like this self-fulfilling where you make it really small, it's hard for people to access, nobody's using it, you're not seeing any new supply come on, and then it sort of tells lawmakers, like, see, nobody wants this. It's not a popular option for families. We don't see a lot of demand. So it's kind of, you know, you have to figure it out. I think, again, like, getting back to your point, the more, like, if we were looking at other public programs, we often take on risk or more expense because we know that the easier we make it for people to access the program, the more likely they are to use it. The more likely the people furthest from the opportunity are to get access to it by removing those barriers. So that's just something we're always trying to keep in mind too. Like, these things that we're putting in place to target spending or eligibility are actually making it harder for those very kids to access the opportunity.
So we're at time, but can you two stay around for a little bit to take any further questions?
Definitely.
Okay, great. And I just want to mention for people who are interested in having a voice in policymaking, when the recordings go up, we did sponsor a panel as well that was exploring that very idea of how do edupreneurs get involved in the policy process. So I encourage you to take a look at that when it comes online. And thank you for attending today. And yeah, we'll stick around for other questions.